are listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and I am joined today by Evie Moss. Evie is a longtime friend, but she is also the founder of Moss Appeal. Evie, welcome.
Hello, Heather. Thanks for inviting me.
So you are one of the first people that I met when I got into the podcast
Likewise.
space long time ago. I was representing a podcast that you are also representing.
I know, Frenemies.
I was like, oh, I know. There's this woman in New York selling podcast advertising.
There's a woman in LA selling podcast advertising.
I know. And those were in the days when everyone wasn't selling podcast advertising. There were very few companies doing it. So tell me a little bit about kind of how you entered the podcast space.
Yeah. And I want to know about you too, since we ended up in a similar place and you then kind of eclipsed me in the expertise of podcast sales. But my career started in radio. I'm the daughter of a broadcast radio person as well. So I grew up in and around audio, and I worked at many stations, primarily as a copywriter and a voice talent, and then did that as an actor for a little bit. And then when I got back into media after acting, I went back into radio. So fast forward, after a stint working in ad sales marketing at some major cable networks like Lifetime and E, I went back to radio. That led me to another rep firm that we know and love, AdLarge, and they were launching a new thing, this podcast division. So I learned to rep that. Actually, I was on the marketing team for that, and then tried to identify some talent that might be part of the stable. And that's how you and I both came across that same podcast. And I started freelancing a bit. And that was one of my early stage consulting projects in podcasting, that same podcast as you.
And I'm so curious. I was thinking about that show the other day. I was like, I should look her up.
It's still around. Harvesting Happiness. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a good show.
Yes. Lisa from Harvesting Happiness. It is. Yeah. And she was so impressive to me at that point because she had been doing podcasting in a really professional way. I had worked with podcasts that weren't doing it in a very professional way. And it was, I feel like that was kind of part of my evolution process, was being able to identify who is actually someone who I can trust to read the ad and publish episodes consistently and do a good job with the ad read, because really that wasn't the case. And it still isn't the case, but she did do a good job. Did you find that as well?
Agree. And, also learning to create a pitch deck and talk about what a good host could and should do to evangelize a product. Yeah, that was a great experience for me. But again, you took it all the way to the bank, sister. You did great.
It's been such a fun industry to be part of. So tell us a little bit about what Moss Appeal is today. What does it look like?
Yeah, I'm a solopreneur, but I hire expert vendors in any area and I oversee them to basically, my mission is to create multi-platform content that helps drive revenue. So my chops that I gained at places like Lifetime and Ampersand and Westwood One are applied in the content and marketing strategy that I use on clients that have included everyone from early stage direct TV on through, oh my gosh, rewriting websites and creating content for a clothing manufacturer. So I primarily do B2B marketing and heavy up in content creation as a way to get the word out about pretty much any vertical or brand.
You personally create a fair amount of content. You're a very proficient writer, and I know you do a fair amount of writing, but you also have your own podcast. So tell us a little bit about the content that you
Thank you for
create.
asking. I am a journalist by training, and as a big part of my craft, I was the managing editor at a trade publication called Media Village, and I helped launch one called The Continuum. And I frequently have bylines now. I'm a hired gun for publications like Synopsis, Customerland. I've written for Advertising Age, and in addition, because I believe that people buy from people they trust, I'm not a hard hitting investigative journalist. I'm a trade journalist. And my goal is always to help put forth the value proposition of any executive or any company or brand. So, because I love audio, a natural extension of that is interviewing those folks on my show, which is called Insider Interviews with E.B. Moss. And Heather, I might hit you up to advise me on a name change. It's not that SEO friendly, but it's Insider Interviews. And I do try to humanize and bring out the part of that interviewee that people will trust. I've
Mhm.
probably done a couple hundred episodes by now. And then just as a little sidebar, my personal passion area, aside from swing dancing, having been an actor, I know a lot of folks who have risen to the top of their craft. So I have a sidebar podcast called It's Quite a Living. So, little known
I
fact.
don't know if I realized you had that. And what is It's Quite a Living
It's
about?
about my it's
About
about my
acting?
friends in high places. I'm just very fortunate that I have this Venn diagram of successful folks. So, for example, the theme music of Insider Interviews was composed by a multi-Grammy winning composer and famous jazz bassist named John Clayton. So I interviewed John on my most recent episode of It's Quite a Living. When I was an actor and doing voiceover in San Francisco, a fellow actor and fantastic voice talent there was a woman named Amy Hill, who played Kumo on Magnum PI for 5 seasons. And you've probably seen her in a lot of
Wow.
things like My Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. So I interviewed Amy, just a bunch of folks like that, even Robin Thicke's mother. Gloria Loring was a
Oh,
big soap
wow.
opera star and a singer. So
That is so, so
it is
fun. I
fun.
love
That's
that.
why it's my
Well,
passion
so
project.
yeah, yeah. And I think all the time that I should start a passion project podcast because this is my passion.
Yes.
Podcasting is definitely my passion. Is and it really probably is my first passion. But I think it would be fun to start
I
another podcast too.
do have to say, I'll just
um,
like give a little plug for one episode. I discovered a long lost cousin, and he happens to be the
wow.
CEO of USA Fencing, as in the history making Olympics and Paralympics team. So Phil Andrews was just on my Insider Interviews podcast also. But as much as I know about sports is nothing. So
Yeah. No, that is so cool. How very fun. So you are obviously, as we've talked about, a writer. You create all different kinds of forms of content. What about audio has really attracted
mm,
you? Because I feel like you are one of the queens of podcasting. I feel like you're so involved in the industry. Your voice is so prominent. You're always there and part of the conversation, helping, I would say, kind of mediate conversations in a lot of ways. What has really kind of driven you to audio? Besides the fact that your dad maybe was from radio, or
well,
maybe that's
there's a
it. I don't
big
know.
apple tree continuum. I think that we always see that, if your parent was a banker, you might be a banker, what have you. I'm happy my dad was in radio. And by the way, my brother and sister are both in media as well. Yes,
Oh,
my brother
cool.
was a head writer for Wolf Blitzer for 15 years. I know. My sister's in healthcare
Crazy. That's
marketing.
awesome.
So I love that it's typically, the theater of the mind. I think I love words. I consume words. That's why I like writing and reading, not arithmetic. And so I'm constantly picturing things. And to me, when I hear
Mhm.
audio, it puts a vision in my mind. And I just think it's great. I also think that we retain what we learn in audio almost better than any other sense, perhaps other than, believe it or not, I think it's smell. But our sense of hearing really impacts our brain. That's why we remember jingles so well. Um,
Mm,
yeah, so audio is just very close to my heart and my head. Um, and then I
mhm,
love
mhm.
hearing other people's stories, learning where they came from and talking about that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I consume so much audio, but I feel like I learned so much. I've listened to so many books and so obviously so many podcasts too, but I
Yeah.
learned very well
Yeah.
through audio. So, there's power there. You and I both had the opportunity to attend Advertising Week in New York last week. That was my in New York, and it was really great. I think what I loved most about it was it wasn't just
Yeah.
podcasting. There were so many
Oh
other
my goodness.
people from so many different other industries, right? And just the conversation is very rich. Tell us kind of what your takeaways were from Ad Week.
All right, so I had to make a list. There was fangirling because for the media industry, there were a lot of people there that I was like, "Ah," anybody who reads any of my social media posts or, read things from Podcast Movement, for example, also knows that I was thrilled that I got to see Ira Glass, here at
Mhm.
Advertising Week. That was fun. He was at Podcast Movement also. And then Shelley Lazarus, man, what amazing energy. Ad agency doyen, amazing woman. Aaron Walton, always great to listen to. So there were some of our greats that were there. But a really fun mainstream takeaway was the fact that I got to interview Master P, Percy Miller, the billionaire rapper. Um, I know. So shoulder
Wow.
rubbing with the creme de la creme at Advertising Week was fun. But on a
Yeah.
more sort of brainiac level, I would say that oh my gosh, Heather, all things AI, how are we incorporating that and what are best practices these days from the video perspective, all things churn and streaming still finding its footing. Then we talk about all things programmatic and with podcasting in particular because there was a podcast zone. Yay, sounds profitable. um, there was talk about pixels and discoverability and programmatic again and the things we always talk about. But what I thought was fascinating was some of the talk about content and influencers. And what we talked about at the beginning, how people buy from people they trust. Great quote from Ryan
Mhm.
Dieter about how people trust creators more than brands. And then just to
Mhm.
finish that thought, he was on a panel with a very high profile influencer. We call them creators, Vivian too. And she talked about how it's no longer a dollar a dance or a dance for a dollar. That's what she said. Now it's about the storytelling and taking the listener or the consumer on a journey as the creator. So those were things that
Mhm.
jumped out of
Mhm.
my mind from Advertising Week, but it was jam packed, man. How about you?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it was so great. I think that what really stood out to me that I love to watch is the parallels between CTV and
Yes.
podcasting. And one of the things that one of the speakers commented on that I just really loved was that in CTV, the targeting is probably more challenging than it is in podcasting. And what he said is just because an audience is unidentifiable doesn't mean that they're not
Hmm.
valuable. And I do really feel like because we have so many digital buyers in this space, they are so obsessed often with, I want to find the exact person that I'm looking for. And it's almost like if I'm not putting in that I want listeners between the ages of 25 and 45 into a computer system, that I'm not going to
Right.
get those people, right? And it's like, well, let's just talk about the content. How about that? Like, who do we think is actually listening to this, right? We don't have to have
Right.
total proof that 100% these people are listening. There is value there. And I really loved that it doesn't have to always be quite so black and white. So I felt like that was
Yeah.
like really great for me to hear. And it's nice to hear that other people are struggling with that beyond just
Well,
podcasting.
two things on that. One is, of course, we all want to know about attribution, and, last touch point, et cetera. And so creating content is sort of the long tail in a way. Steve Pratt has a book out, and it's about growth and audience and growing your podcasting. And he was just talking the other day about how you wouldn't want to have somebody propose to you on the first date, right? You want to build a relationship. And so we have to have patience and understanding that growth comes from building that trust and repeat exposure. You won't always know what that last point was that got them to the store. Um, and then
Mhm.
there's something to be said for smaller audiences, to your point, Heather. And, you know, what about local at scale? That's interesting also. And that applies to
Mhm.
CTV because there are so many fast channels out there now for niche audiences that are also being geo targeted. So that's free ad supported television.
Mhm.
So just like there's a plethora of podcasts now, there's a plethora of CTV or fast channels, and everybody has to find
Mhm.
their audience, and it might not be an immediate turnaround to get them to purchase, but it's the buildup, I believe, and building that trust.
Mhm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I have Steve's book on
Yeah,
my reading list, and so it's called
I
Earn
think
It,
so.
correct? Yeah, yeah, I'm gonna definitely have to check that out. So I'm curious, do you personally subscribe to any fast channels? Because I feel like I've been hearing fast channels like kind of thrown around. When I think about my own of CTV consumption, it's pretty mainstream, the typical subscriptions that most people have. But have you discovered any that you really like?
Um, well, I will pay homage to a client slash friend of mine, and I'll answer that by way of explaining what they're doing. Leap is an interesting agency that both creates content and then buys fast channel advertising to drive to the content on the fast channel that they've created. So, for example, they worked with some of Peter Greenberg, the famous travel journalist. He has a lot of video
Mm,
content. They compiled that
mhm,
into a beautiful travel show, and they'll focus that on, it might be Peru or it might be the Southwest, whatever it is. And they'll use that as an anchor and then additional fresh shot content. And then that will be sponsorable, and that lives beautifully in a travel fast channel. And then they'll sell advertising in your bailiwick um, to they'll sell the eyeballs to that show. So they're creating the content and then they're selling the inventory that pushes to it, which I think is a brilliant model because there really is something for everyone. Okay, I think that this is a lesson in authenticity and trust. I know that I'm going to break that word by the time this episode is over. I keep talking about trust, but it goes hand in hand with authenticity, right? Day before
mm,
yesterday, I surprised a friend of mine from Lifetime Television a million years ago who was in town. She asked if I could get together, and I couldn't. I was at the Digital Out of Home Summit, and she was going to see a Broadway show. And
mm,
it's like, oh, I'm so sorry I'll miss you, Pat. But, what show are you seeing? She said, going to go see Once Upon a Mattress. I'll be in seat B115 if you get a free night and want to join. I bought the ticket next to her. Then a friend of mine, also from Lifetime, who hadn't seen Pat in 10 years, bought the seat next to me. Then a friend of mine happened to be at the show. I gave him my phone. He videotaped us surprising Pat. Okay, long story short, 150,000 views on TikTok in 48 hours.
Oh my
All because it was
goodness.
just authentic. It was genuine. It was storytelling, as Vivian too explained, and it was a heartwarming story. So I'm telling you,
Mhm.
people will watch anything.
Well, especially if it grabs at your heartstrings, like you were saying,
Yeah.
right? It's something that's interesting. So, obviously, this podcast is about podcasting, and you and I are very much in tune with the audio space, but there is power in creating content beyond audio. And I know that there's been so much talk of that lately. I think that from just the audio perspective of, hey, you're creating a podcast, but oh, maybe you should put that on YouTube. Maybe if you're going to put it on YouTube, you might as well
Mhm.
create video. And then we can go on and on from there. But what would you say is the real value in creating content beyond just audio?
Oh, well, the classic we'll call them consumer, hit the consumer wherever they are. And that applies to both the path to purchase, as well as building your brand and your message. So I think what drove podcasting, for example, was people's joy of having audio on demand, that they could listen to what they wanted, when they wanted, while they were washing the dishes, walking the dog, the classic thing. It's the same as why
Mhm.
radio in cars has always been such a great companion. So there's the take them, along with you, have it in your pocket. But then what
Mhm.
happens when you're not listening, when you just want to sit there and you're on your laptop and you're going through newsletters or you're trying to research something? Well, then you need to read something, or you are, as my friend at Leap does, pointing eyeballs to content that's on a fast channel. So I really think that you have to be everywhere and you have to have a through line to all of that content.
Mhm.
So, what's your value proposition? Why should we trust you? And communicate that at every step of the turn. That's classic marketing.
And so I guess I'm curious, one thing that always has stood out to me at social
Mhm.
media marketing world, I want to say it was in like
Uh-huh. I have the
2019.
t-shirt.
I heard a couple of speakers there. They were actually the keynote, and they talked so much about this idea of loving the content
Mm.
that you were creating. And they did this kind of whole skit about like what it's like to, the kind of the hard work of writing a blog post, and then the hard work of creating, like at that time I'm sure we talked more about Facebook, and the hard work of creating this and the hard work of creating that. And they essentially said, hey, if you're not enjoying creating this content, what makes you think people are going to enjoy consuming it? And
Oh,
that really has always stuck out to me, because I've thought, if you as the content creator aren't passionate about what you're
yeah.
doing and you're just creating something kind of to create it, like what is the consumer really getting? And like you've been mentioning, how much authenticity is there? So while of course there is power in being in so many different locations, how can a content creator, I guess, really decide which platforms they should be part of? Is it just the
Mm.
passion that they have for that content kind of vertical, or what are
I
your
think it's
thoughts
a
on that?
fascinating question. And I think the adage has always been to understand where your target audience is. That kind of goes back to
Mm,
what we were talking about. Is it a niche audience or what have you? Do you always have to find that consumer wherever they are? Or can you be multiple places? To consider if it's a platform that you love might be a little too egocentric, I think, for marketing best practices. I do really like Threads now as the antidote to X, if you will. I'm on both.
mm, mhm,
I want Threads to win, but I'm not getting as much traction there. So that's
mhm.
interesting. And I am definitely a case study of, addicted to those TikTok videos. So maybe because I do like that, the fact that my video kind of blew up, I don't know, maybe that's part of the love, but I think that you have to understand what your customer, your prospect, your audience loves and be there and
Mhm.
suck it up and learn that platform.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do agree with you. And I would say that what we're seeing in the podcast space, which is really fascinating to me, is the idea of more 360 integrated
Mhm.
campaigns. So advertisers are saying, hey, let's not just consider the podcast, but let's advertise on the podcast and the YouTube channel and the social platforms and the newsletter. And in my opinion, there's going to be so much
Yeah.
crossover between all of those different platforms that the consumer is getting these multiple touch points for that advertiser. And then we also know, as much as we love audio, that it isn't always as actionable as other things because there isn't a link that is right there in your face that you can
Mhm.
easily click on. So I guess what's your perspective? Should advertisers be considering these 360
I
opportunities?
think we have to find a balance, and there are a couple of parts about that. The first, caution flag that I'm throwing down is, please, Lord, don't let us turn into my beloved radio's foibles of jamming in way too many ads, just as broadcast TV
Mhm.
did, and as we're starting to see now with ad supported, Netflix, Hulu, etc. The challenge also, aside from tonnage of ad loads, is how we figure out to not overserve. My
Mm.
last episode interviewed someone at Freewheel, Chris Magel, who talked about his Aunt Pat being a martini lover. And, it would be great to serve her a vodka ad, but don't overserve her in both senses of the words with vodka ad, vodka ad, vodka ad, throw in a steak ad, throw in a dessert ad, whatever it is. So we have to learn how to, as Freewell is trying to do, I think, limit the ad repetition. I think we've all experienced that.
Mhm.
Limit our ad loads and balance the desire to make money with what's best for the medium. And then do you have
Mhm.
to be do you have to be everywhere? Um, it's so overwhelming. And certainly with AI enabling versioning and different placements, it's a little easier. Oh my gosh. But then don't get me started on sustainability and the energy that it takes to store media files. I think I'm going off on a tangent, so I don't have a better answer than that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I have never talked to anybody about the sustainability of video or of digital
Yeah,
files. So that is very
that should be an
fascinating, but
entire
I suppose a
episode.
topic. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. A topic for a different episode. I will say one of the things that I feel like is so important that I love the over serving, and that is such a great analogy. I might have to borrow that one. Um,
Episode 29,
but
just
the
saying.
reality Okay, okay, I'm gonna have to check it out. No, I love that. But, it's interesting because podcasters I always want to encourage, like, content creators to think beyond advertising for
Ah,
essentially generating revenue. So I think for some reason, and maybe it's because we are in an advertising-centric world, the minute that they create something, they think, "I should
mhm,
have ads in it." And I have had so many conversations over the years where, first of all, I'm like, "Your audience is just too small." Like, it doesn't make sense to put ads in your show because 'cause you're not reaching enough people. But also, how much money are you actually gonna
right,
make? And I think that that's part of the issue that a lot of podcasters don't realize is that if you've got 1,000 people listening to your show, congratulations. Like, that's a lot of listeners. When we look at the size of a podcast, getting 1,000 unique listeners to your show is not an
correct.
easy feat. But from a CPM basis, if we're charging $20 per 1,000 listeners,
You ain't gonna
do
retire
you
off
really
that.
wanna run
Yeah,
an ad? Exactly. Do you really wanna run an ad for $20? So, people don't think beyond how they can create income beyond someone just
yeah,
handing them money. And so I really think content creators need to think beyond it. And so I feel like that's really important. And then The other thing I was going to mention, so fascinating to me, I just had a call this morning with one of our kid podcast networks, and we were lamenting the lack of ads on kids shows because it still is such a struggle to get advertisers on kids shows. And I really don't think the industry fully comprehends the power of kid podcasts. And I
Yeah.
think there's a big miss there. But she was saying that the ads that we have had on her shows, that she has gotten a ton of complaints from
Oh,
parents that have said, "Why are you advertising to my child?" And, I mean, I think we kind of have to look sometimes at the content and say, what does make the most sense here? And I'm not saying I do think that kid podcasts should have advertisers, but it's really valuable to have good alignment. Right? A kid isn't going to necessarily care if they hear a really fun, engaging, interesting
yeah.
ad about a toy or an app or, something that excites them, but they don't necessarily really want to hear about life insurance or investment
Right.
products or, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
And
it's really important, I think, to look at context.
exactly, appropriateness. And, of course, there's something to be said for co listening. And of course, with the life insurance, you're reaching the parent. But I got to tell you, also, a lot of the buzz at Advertising Week was about reaching Gen Zero, Brandon Young, Brandon Early.
Oh,
And they will be the consumers to win over in just a couple more years. Um,
yeah.
Interesting little sidebar here, Heather, also is, and I feel like I want to write a post about this, but I live near a weekly flea market of sorts, and they sell everything from, you know, top us to antiques. And the most crowded booth for 3 weeks in a row has been the pile of analog watches, like old school watches, not like your Fitbit or your iWatch or anything like that, but like the old hands on the dial. The kids are snapping them up. And so I interviewed a couple of them and I said, why, why, why do you want your grandfather's Timex? And they said, we're tired of screens.
Wow.
Right? You heard it here first. So there's a balance. Um, don't
Yeah.
overload us. Choose appropriate ad per content. Be in the key places where you should be, and find a balance between authenticity and driving, to be the what's new, what's next, fast new thing with, slow it down a little bit and build trust.
Yes. Yeah. No, no, absolutely. Well, Evie, I know that we need to start wrapping it up here. I'm curious if you feel like you have any kind of predictions or kind of thoughts about what's next for the audio
Um,
space.
Well, I think that, the cautionary tale is how we need to be careful about ad load. I do see that as a slippery slope. I
Mm.
mentioned AI, but holy moly, what is it? Notebook LLM, I think, with generating AI voices and being able to translate text to pretty human sounding voices terrifies me. Um, but it's coming. And I think, video podcasting, you and I are doing both. I am definitely a fan of both audio and video. I think that those are some key areas that we're going to see immediately come to the fore.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I know that AI is its own topic
Yeah.
of in and of itself, but I struggle with it because I see the opportunities with AI and, um, I know like we've got Oscar from Wondercraft coming on the show here in a couple of weeks, and I'm excited to talk to him. I think he's been doing some really interesting work with his company. And I see the value of being able to switch content out, right? So it's like, hey, I'm creating an ad read and I want maybe my call to action to be changed, but I don't want to have to sit down and re-record it every time. So, I mean, there are like little snippets of ads that could be
Mhm.
updated really easily, or we could maybe split test ads much more quickly by AI generated voices. But to me, there is a level of authenticity, I guess, that I go back to that I really struggle with. I don't personally want to listen to AI generated audio content
Um,
unless I suppose that audio content was very
yeah.
educational, right? So, if, for instance, maybe I want to learn about how to grow the very best vegetable garden, and there are some very specific things that I need to do, just like if I'm using
Yeah.
Chat GPT to say, okay, what is the best, insurance policy of this year? Or, it's like if I'm sifting through large amounts of
Yeah.
information and it can distill it down easily and make it very actionable, I think I would be okay with that. But part of the beauty of podcasting is the storytelling and is the personal connection and that level of engagement. And even if we're just using it for ads, it feels like we're stripping away a lot of that.
It's true, although I think my first exposure to recognizing how advanced these voices, AI voices, have gotten already, was a recent episode of our friend James Cridland's show where he was talking about that and dropped in a back and forth of a male and female voice. And it was after the fact that he said those were AI generated. And honestly, there's voiceover, and then there's using your radio voice, and then there's the kind of back and forth that you and I can have as humans. And for the radio voice, it will sound incredibly realistic. They're already doing
Mm.
interruptions and asides and laughter that doesn't sound canned. It's remarkable. So for the immediate, or the near term, I should say, probably use case is terrific in B2B, in informational. Um, and the radio voices style, my old trade, will be useful for AI generated voices, and especially for narrating things that, say, for the blind, or transcribing in languages, etc. So incredible use cases that already sound really good and have fooled me. We have to worry about things
Mm.
like Sora when it's combined with video AI, and the wool is pulled over our eyes. But for, I think, the near term, AI voices are really coming on quickly. Unlike, we had to interrupt, you had to do a little edit here because my phone started ringing and my old landline announced call from spam risk. Spam risk. That was not a good AI generated voice.
No, no, no. But I don't know. I think I kind of like that computer generated voice better
Well,
than one that sounds
because
real.
we know not to trust it or to trust it.
Because we can distinguish
That word again,
exactly.
trust.
That's
Yep,
the scary part, right? It's the scary part.
agree.
So, yeah, so interesting. Well, Evie, thank you so much for being on the show. If people are interested in getting in touch with you, where can they find you?
Podcasts at mossappeal.com. That would be great. Everything on social is at Moss Appeal. Get it? Mass Appeal, Moss Appeal. Okay. And then my show is Insider Interviews with E.B. Moss. Thank you so much, Heather. It's so fun talking to you.
Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed this conversation. I know we covered a lot of really interesting topics in this episode. If you haven't had the chance to check out my YouTube channel, head on over to YouTube, where you can find the Podcast Advertising Playbook and Heather Osgood. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next time. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.